You may have heard me say, because I've said it so many times, that I often find that I have to educate evolutionists while I'm debating them. In this video, I'm going to show you a remarkable example of me doing just that. A beautiful example. I don't think a better example could be had. I recently debated two fellows at the same time about evolution and creation. One of them, James Downer, the other, Jackson Wheat. And Jackson Wheat brought up the Italian wall lizard as evidence of evolution. And I explained to him that there was no such thing as evidence of evolution. Now, this science paper, I want you to pay attention, says anatomical and physiological changes associated with dietary shift in this lizard. This part, this here, this word anatomical in this paper, that's a lie. There was no anatomical difference. There was physiological change only. Just to help you understand the subject, this is what was mentioned. In 1971, researchers loosed a few examples of this particular lizard on two islands off the coast of Italy in the Mediterranean. And researchers went back 36 years later and found some of these lizards, and they examined them, and they discovered that they had what are called cecal valves in their stomachs that don't exist in the parent population from the mainland. They declared this to be evolution in action. In only 36 years, the organism had evolved cecal valves in its stomach. Well, that's not true. It didn't evolve anything. It adapted. That's all it did. The lizard already has the same organ called a cecal valve. It's not actually an organ. What it is a muscle in the stomach. They already have this muscle. All that happened was that the muscle became more robust in response to a plant diet. They used to eat animals like crickets and mealworms and grasshoppers, things like that, and then loosed on the island, they had to adapt to a plant diet. The plants are tough and hard to chew, so the lizards adapted to that environmental change, that dietary change, by getting a more robust jaws, slightly bigger jaws, slightly wider heads, an elongated gut, and an increased size to this muscle in the stomach that helped them to digest the plant matter, which is harder to digest than animal matter like grubworms and earthworms and crickets and such things. So that's the changes that the lizard experienced. Now, in my debate, Jackson Wheat brings up this lizard and says, look, evolution in only 36 years. But that's not what happened. What happened was, as I explained to him, this is an example of nothing more than phenotypic plasticity. Mutations did not occur that created the genetic information for the organism to have cecal valves in its stomach. Firstly, it already has cecal valves. The muscles are less robust. And it wasn't random genetic mutations that did it. The organism gained no new genetic information to create an anatomical feature that did not exist in the creature before. But the evolutionists are still claiming, we still have evolutionists claiming, that this is an example of evolution. This actually was an embarrassment to evolutionists when scientists discovered by experimentation that this creature expressed its genes to make the cecal valve more robust, the muscle in its gut more robust, and these minor morphological changes, these adaptations to their environment. Now, creationists understand organisms adapt. That's a beautiful example of intelligent design, that organisms can adapt. But no genetic information arose that creates cecal valves in the organism's stomach. And one of my debate opponents, Jackson Wheat, claimed that random mutation is what produced them. That mutations created new genetic information that produced cecal valves in the gut of this lizard. I told him that wasn't so. I told him they already had the genetic information to create the cecal valves, and all this was phenotypic plasticity. He argued with me and said, no, I was wrong. But what we find out is that he was wrong. And in fact, he uploaded a video not long ago explaining that he was wrong, admitting it without admitting it. Evolutionists, they don't like to admit they were wrong. So what he did was make a video trying to save face for being shown wrong about this in our debate. And I'm going to show you the proof of that. So here's how I educated Jackson Wheat in our debate. I informed him that there was no anatomical change take place in the animal, that the organism simply expressed its genes in one way so as to make the cecal valve appear, that is, the muscle become more robust in the gut, and when examples of these lizards were taken into the laboratory by scientists and examined, they were given then an animal diet of grub worms and crickets and such. Their cecal valves seemed to, quote unquote, disappear. They didn't actually disappear, they just stopped being robust. The muscles are still there, they just went down to their normal size again. And Jackson Wheat denied this. He said that the cecal valves arose because of random mutations. That he said genetic mutation was responsible for the cecal valve appearing in the body plan in the anatomy of the animal, and that's not true. Then when I told him that researchers had taken these creatures into the laboratory in a controlled environment, changed their diet, the cecal valves, quote unquote, disappeared again, that is, actually reduced to their previous size, he denied that. He said that wasn't true. So those are the two things that I had to educate Jackson Wheat about. Then he uploads a video admitting that everything I told him was true, as a way of trying to save face because he doesn't want to look like somebody who denies science. So here's the results of that.
Have you ever heard of Italian wall lizard? There was a population moved from one island to another, and via natural selection, they developed new characteristics.
No, they didn't. No.
Yes, they did actually. They have changed both ethologically, and they have changed in their morphology slightly because it's only a few decades, but they have changed. And
sure. See, I discussed that. That's one of the first things I talked about when I got on the internet.
We know that this occurred via mutations and recombination, generating genetic diversity. We know that this occurred via mutations and recombination.
Now here's a snippet from Jackson Wheat's video that he uploaded not long ago after our debate, in which he admits that I was exactly right when I told him that mutation and natural selection weren't responsible for the development of cecal valves in the anatomy of the lizard, but it was nothing more than phenotypic plasticity, which is exactly what I told him, that the organism already had the genetic information to produce the cecal valve, and they simply expressed it to make the muscle in the gut more robust, and then later when the diet changed, less robust. He denied the researchers had done this, and he denied that genetic mutations were not the mechanism for it, because he needs, as an evolutionist, to believe that random mutations and natural selection has designed all the features of living things. Now here's a snippet from the video he uploaded later to try to save face, in which he points to the very scientific research paper that I told him about in our debate, that researchers had taken these lizards into a controlled environment, changed their diet back to an animal-based diet, and the cecal valve allegedly disappeared. It didn't actually disappear, it simply became less robust. It shrank in size because the organism changed the way it expressed its genes. That's called phenotypic plasticity.
Authors of some of the original studies on the Podmacaro lizards predicted that the cecal valves were the result of genetic changes, but later studies showed that they were instead the result of phenotypic plasticity.
Here he is in our debate denying that phenotypic plasticity was the cause for the cecal valve change in the organism. He had claimed that random mutation developed the cecal valve, then discovered that I was right because he points to the scientific paper that explains that very thing. But here he is denying it in our debate, that claiming that mutation is what generated the cecal valve instead of phenotypic plasticity. And when I explained to him that researchers had verified this, he said that wasn't true. Then later in his video he put up trying to save face, he points to the very scientific paper that I pointed to in our debate, in which I told him researchers verified this by taking the animal into a controlled environment, changing its diet, and the cecal valves reduced to its normal size.
We know that this occurred via mutations and recombination. Authors of some of the original studies on the Podmacaro lizards predicted that the cecal valves were the result of genetic changes. We know that this occurred via mutations and recombination, but later studies showed that they were instead the result of phenotypic plasticity. We know that this occurred via mutations and recombination, phenotypic plasticity and not mutations, phenotypic plasticity and not mutations. We know that this occurred via mutations and recombination, but later studies showed that they were instead the result of phenotypic plasticity. phenotypic plasticity and not mutations. We know that this occurred via mutations and recombination, phenotypic plasticity and not mutations. We know that this occurred via mutations and recombination, phenotypic plasticity and not mutations.
So here's the claim. Okay, so this is what actually happened. They released a lizard on an island in the Mediterranean. They came back 36 years later. Researchers collected some of these lizards, and they studied them and found cecal valves in their stomachs that were not there. They're not in the parent population that existed on the mainland of Italy. Okay, so they changed the diet of these lizards in a controlled environment to an arthropod diet.
No, they did not. But later studies showed that they were instead the result of phenotypic plasticity.
After 16 weeks, these cecal valves disappeared again. So what this demonstrated is that a change in the environment when the lizard was loosed on the island, a change in its diet, caused the organism to respond to that environment by stop expressing the genes that produce cecal valves in its stomach. Then when the organism was taken from the island and back to the mainland and its diet was reverted to its original, they gained the cecal, they lost the cecal valves again. So all this proves that the genetic information to produce the cecal valves already existed in the lizard.
No, that is not what that means.
Mutation didn't design it. It was
that is not what that means.
So all this proves that the genetic information to produce the cecal valves already existed in the lizard.
No, that is not what that means.
Mutation didn't design it. It was
that is not what that means.
So you just heard Jackson Wheat say, no, that is not what happened. That the researchers didn't verify that it was phenotypic plasticity and not random mutations building the information that creates cecal valves. In our debate, that's what he claimed. But then in his later video, after he investigated the paper that I told him about, he found that that's exactly what happened, that it was phenotypic plasticity and not mutation which developed the cecal valves.
Authors of some of the original studies on the Podmacaro lizards predicted that the cecal valves were the result of genetic changes, but later studies showed that they were instead the result of phenotypic plasticity. We know that this occurred via mutations and recombination, phenotypic plasticity and not mutations. The fact that the aforementioned morphological changes were likely the result from phenotypic plasticity and not mutations does not invalidate their significance to our understanding of evolution.
There you have it, an example of how you have to educate evolutionists when you debate them, as I've said many times. James Downard and Jackson Wheat denied that the changes to the cecal valve in the Italian wall lizard was produced by random mutations, and this was, of course, in line with what evolutionists believe, that mutations accruing add the information to create the various new structures that appear in the body plans of living things, and this is why we have a tree of life. This is a negative impact on evolution theory. He doesn't want to believe that either, but of course it does have a negative impact on evolution, because evolution is simply false. So here we have Jackson Wheat doing a double take, denying that, first claiming that random mutations had developed cecal valves in the stomach of these lizards, which was not so, and denying that researchers had verified this by taking the lizards into a controlled environment, changing their diet, and watching the cecal valves disappear again. He denied those things in our debate, then later makes a video where he describes the very scientific paper that I told him about in our debate, which he said did not happen, that the researchers did not take these animals into a controlled environment and verify that the cecal valve was produced by phenotypic plasticity and not mutations, accruing new genetic information which developed cecal valves. He denies that. Then he makes a video admitting this without admitting he was wrong. So here's how I educated Jackson Wheat in a debate and James Downard, because you have to educate them about science when you debate them. And so Jackson Wheat admitted that he was wrong about two claims in his debate, and then uploads by uploading a video which he talks about it as though this is going to save face. It doesn't. I had to educate him. His claims were wrong. It was not random mutations that developed the information that created cecal valves. It was phenotypic plasticity, exactly as I said. It was verified as phenotypic plasticity by researchers when they changed the diet of the lizards in a controlled environment, and the cecal valves disappeared again. He denied that happened as well. Then uploads a video trying to save face where he admits everything I told him in our debate was true. That's how it works with evolutionists. You have to educate them while you debate them. So all this proves that the genetic information to produce the cecal valves already existed in the lizard.
No, that is not what that means.
Mutation didn't design it. It was
That is not what that
there.
means. We know that this occurred via mutations and recombination. Authors of some of the original studies on the Podmacaro lizards predicted that the cecal valves were the result of genetic changes, but later studies showed that they were instead the result of phenotypic plasticity. We know that this occurred via mutations and recombination, phenotypic plasticity and not mutations, 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 phenotypic plasticity and not mutations. We know that this occurred via mutations and recombination.